by 2050. Yet, these emissions are going up at record levels. We're on course for a 14% increase this decade. It is this pollution trapped in the thin shell of atmosphere around our planet, combined with the depletion of the carbon sinks, like forests, that fuels the chaotic and extreme weather patterns that we're seeing. And so this is a pattern and trajectory that includes the stronger storms, like the deluge in Pakistan that's killed thousands and left 2/3 of the country, or maybe it's 1/3 of the country, underwater. Like Fiona, which just hit Puerto Rico one day after the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria, that hit there in the Virgin Islands. And incidentally, Hurricane Maria killed more Americans in total than the attacks of 9/11 did. The New England Journal of Medicine produced that analysis. And like the storm named Ian that's bearing down on Florida right now, and the ones that have hit New York that have been mentioned today, like Superstorm Sandy, like Ida last year, which first made landfall in Louisiana, but then traveled north to our city, killing, as we know, 11 people in basement apartments. And as Kizzy Charles Guzman just reminded us, it's not only the storms. There are also other impacts that especially affect New York City, like heat. And as Peter Goodidis reminded us, it will bring more, this climate crisis emergency will bring more displaced people to our city from all over the world. The UN International Panel on Climate Change estimated that over the next 30 years, 143 million people will be uprooted by climate change. And they come here to New York City not only because of economic opportunity, but because of the character of our city. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And so the war on nature that the Secretary General talked about is indeed suicidal on a species level because, of course, we are nature. The air in our lungs, the water we drink, the soil and the sunshine that nourishes life forms that comprise the food that we eat. And we all depend on the health of the biosphere for our survival. But it is also true that those who suffer the most from this crisis have done the least to cause it. That is true globally, and at the UN there's long been a framework and way of talking based on poor nations and rich nations. This is currently focused on the issue of loss and damage. But it is also true within nations and within states and within cities like our own. This training today focuses on faith sector preparedness for climate disasters with regard to the vulnerable communities in New York City. And I will address the topic of the climate emergency and specifically why faith and spiritual communities matter. But before I begin, let me say that I am not only honored to be here, I am humbled. And I'm humbled because I know that the most important voices on this matter come from within the communities that are most impacted by these disasters and impacted by the inequities that compound them. I am not among those most impacted. I do this work from a place of privilege, and I do not forget that. But let me also say that one thing that faith and life experience can do is teach us that we are all here on this earth for a deeper call. When I was a child, my own faith tradition taught me that God looks directly at us through the eyes of someone in need. Someone hungry, thirsty, who needs clothing, much like someone affected by a disaster. From Matthew 25. This teaching takes time to make sense of, and I have done so imperfectly, but I mention it now because I know I'm not alone in having received a teaching like that in formative years, whose power can be tapped, and it is tapped and should be tapped, because those most impacted need solidarity from everyone in this city, not only from those within their own communities. And I also mention it because I have come to hold as the deepest of truths that the notion that Creator, that life force that dwells within but is also beyond our understanding, speaks to us not from the heights of power or the halls of riches, but from the margins. A friend of mine from the Church of Sweden once said that in any room where decisions are being made about climate policy, there should be 3 empty chairs. For those who are most impacted and also least likely to have a voice. And that is one for the poor and marginalized people of the world, one for future generations, and one for all non-human life. And when you think about it, this is not only because that would be more fair, but if we had been making decisions all along with those 3 perspectives in mind, we would not be in this perilous situation as a whole. In realizing this, we can see the connection between Dr. King's famous statement that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and the words of the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh when he said, "We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness." In this time of climate emergency, faith and spiritual communities matter a great deal. For one thing, they are organized, with gathering spaces and volunteer networks that already have a track record of providing relief in partnership with government and on their own. Today, we have already heard, and we will hear more about exactly how this works. And I commend all the speakers and all of the people here and the communities that they represent for the knowledge and the skill and the commitment that you all bring. Faith and spiritual communities are important for another reason, and that is that faith and spirituality are themselves important to how many people respond to these extreme weather events. And I want to mention 3 ways in which this is true. One is that throughout human history, peoples have understood their relationship with water, wind, fire, and land in the context of their relationship with God or with some divine being or beings. This is deep, it is ancient, sometimes it is unnamed, but it is not to be underestimated in terms of the processing that people do, including political leaders, individually and collectively, whether that leads to healing or whether it leads to more pain. And this is what faith communities know and do, and have done as long as people have been talking about Noah and the flood, or the Panchabhutas, the 5 elements of cosmic creation in Hinduism. Many faith communities have been working hard right now to explore this level of theological and spiritual reflection in the context of anthropogenic man-made climate change. As I loved when Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso said, "You have the power to astound." People are astounded. Faith leaders have the power to astound and the power to guide people through that feeling with compassion and care to a place that is healing for all. Another way in which faith and spirituality matter is that, of course, this is not just about how humans relate to nature, it's about how we relate to each other. And every faith tradition has a teaching about caring for the most vulnerable and those who've been harmed. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible warn about mistreating those who are in need, and they condemn societies that ignore that as a measure of their goodness and instead measure their success by metrics of accumulated wealth. In both Amos and Isaiah, they use the metaphor of the measuring tool of a plumb line for God's judgment. Isaiah 28:17, "I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line." There seems no doubt here today, if we think about the plumb line for our society now, it would include how we respond to those who are going to be harmed by these incoming disasters. And third, I want to mention faith and spirituality call people to a deeper sense of shared values that can transcend and transform politics and change the systems that perpetuate harm. The major movements for social change have all been galvanized by faith. In the civil rights movement, not only did Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel march alongside Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but people from synagogues and mosques and churches and temples and ashrams and spiritual communities of all kinds poured into the streets and spoke to those in elected office and also spoke to their own families and neighbors, telling them that this was not just a matter of politics, it was a call to conscience. This is what must happen today around the climate crisis. And it's worth noting that Hurricane Ian, as we meet here now, impacts both Florida and Cuba, peoples across ideological difference. The laws of nature do not care about those divisions, and neither should we as we confront the climate emergency. So my own path in doing this work began at Union Theological Seminary, where I went for a degree in midlife, mid-career, and I found myself in a job there right after I graduated with a master's in social ethics, and that was director of Union Forum. And I had the chance to organize a gathering in conjunction with the United Nations Climate Change Summit of 2014, and the People's Climate March in this city was on that same year. I don't know if anybody here remembers that march was there. In the course of planning and experiencing that conference, Religions to the Earth, and I must acknowledge Dr. Kusamita Peterson, who is here, who is a mentor of mine in this work and a scholar of religion, and very much made that conference happen. I was exposed in that work of planning to the power of faith traditions to guide us in understanding the moral and spiritual dimensions of this crisis and in translating that into practical actions. Interfaith dialogue in particular, and especially when it includes a lot of differing perspectives like Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and also Hindu and other Indic traditions, Buddhist and East Asian and indigenous traditions as well, can distill shared values and also tease out interesting differences. Those differences can be honored and learned from. You can think about, for example, reincarnation versus the afterlife, or learning about sacred sites in natural places like waterfalls and forests rather than in man-made houses of worship, and so on. One participant in this Religions for the Earth conference said that in the past we talked about tolerance, that we tolerated each other, and now it seems we need each other. This interfaith experience can also help to reveal the assumptions and beliefs and moral claims that are embedded in our mainstream society. The Islamic scholar and poet Rumi warned that following conventional opinion can be the ruin of our souls. And surely this is true in a time when conventions include a kind of individualism that is so extreme it leads to both narcissism and isolation for so many. The consumerism that is pervasive, the tendency to talk about monetary wealth as if it were a sign of virtue or talent or worth, and the total disregard and willful ignorance of the true costs of our economic system. Through revealing this kind of value system and drawing instead on our deepest shared values from faith and spiritual traditions, through reaching out to each other, we can make things better. And we can act not just at the level of effect when we do this work, but also at the level of cause. And I was so happy to hear Kizzy speak about that level of cause and how this work is being done to reduce the emissions, to increase the green spaces. The Buddhists speak of karma. And here in this training, there is good karma. After the Religions for the Earth conference, we started for the Center for Earth Ethics at Union, and that is where I work now. And we've held what we call ministers' trainings, ministry in the time of climate crisis. And in those trainings, we cover the science and the policy aspects, and we also explore sacred texts and teachings. and ritual and ceremony, and elements of pastoral care, like dealing with grief and anxiety and trauma. And one of the things that we have learned from the faith leaders that come to these ministers' trainings is that there is so much trauma. In our society, this is particularly among communities that have already experienced racism, poverty, and violence, and then have the pollution and the climate impacts to deal with in this time of ecological crisis. And I want to say that this afternoon you will hear from Jackie Patterson, who will talk about those connections between racial injustice and climate injustice. And there is no one I respect in this movement more than Jackie Patterson. I've been very proud. She's been on the board of advisors of the Center for Earth Ethics since the beginning. The disasters that will come enter that trauma field, and I was also so happy that we heard earlier about understanding the body keeps the score and how we deal with that. Disaster preparedness must reckon with that trauma and recognize that what modern psychotherapy is now emphasizing and what many faith communities have known and emphasized for some time, which is that dealing with that trauma comes best in connection to others, connection to community. And so in closing, I want to say that faith and spiritual communities matter in the climate emergency because it is about so much more than data and science and technology, as important as they may be. It is about people, communities, and the values that we hold most dear. In the end, if we don't act on the level of cause, and if we don't center the well-being of the most vulnerable around us right now, this climate crisis is coming for all of us. It makes me think of the quote that's often attributed to the Indigenous Australian artist and activist Lila Watson. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. The climate crisis has bound us in a way that can liberate. Let us work together. Thank you.